And good morning, everybody. We're live. Congratulations. You made it through the week. Another one in the books of successful food safety, quality assurance, making sure that everybody is happy and healthy and doing your job. And if nobody else says it, Doug and I are here to say, good job. We appreciate you. And if you're new to this is the Food Safety Chat Live. And every Friday at this time on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter, we go through a food safety topic, and it's my pleasure to bring on an expert from the food safety field, and we'll dive deep into a subject. And so one of the things that we love to do here on the chat is type in here where you are at, and I'm in Loveland, Colorado, and Dr. Marshall here is not too far away from me, just a little bit north in Fort Collins, Colorado. So Doug, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, Brian. Always a pleasure to commune for an hour with you every once in a while, and with the folks that join us. So looking forward to a good conversation again today.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so if you are connected with me on LinkedIn, and if you're not, why not, right? You should be. One of the things that I've been doing here recently is pulling out little nuggets of information and posting those on LinkedIn as well. And you'll notice that with Doug, there's more than more than our fair share of nuggets. I actually kind of have to pare it down because he generally has so many interesting and useful things to say that it's hard to pick. So I think you're in for a real treat today for sure. So one of the things that we love to do on the chat here as well is a ceremonial opening drink. So everybody, please join us for your favorite beverage, and cheers. Got my Boulder Brands mug today. Work for these guys. Just such a good logo. I love their logo. They were acquired by Pinnacle, and then Pinnacle was acquired by ConAgra. So always interesting on that side. So our topic for today, and this is kind of an interesting one in that a lot of times, Doug, the big hitters, the high profile things get all the attention. So salmonella in peanut butter and PCA and these type of things, foreign material, allergens, you see these big recalls that are happening. And recently I've noticed, for whatever reason, these things seem to come in trends, is a lot of this, what I'm calling the secondary, and if you get one of these, you're not considering it that, but some of the secondary potential hazards associated with foods have really been having a lot of recalls. And in particular, I this morning on the food safety news, right, there's a big recall going on, and they're tracking down, there's a cryptosporidium, there's a cyclospora. Man, these guys are just all over the place, aren't they?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is probably contributing to a perceived rise in incidences is related to increased surveillance by regulatory agencies and increased understanding by the medical community that short-term diarrhea isn't always associated with bacterial gastroenteritis. So we have a growing community of interested parties paying more attention to non-bacterial gastroenteritis and doing more investigative work, trying to link together what might be an outbreak to a particular vehicle. And I think in most of these circumstances that we're hearing, it's a consumption of some sort of fresh produce or produce that might have been processed, such as frozen berries as an example, but with no kill step in the process.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and there's a big cyclospora outbreak going on right now with a Mexican restaurant here in Colorado. We have raspberries going on with norovirus as well, hepatitis, frozen strawberries, to your point, and also undercooked pork. All of these things are pointing to what you're talking about here. And the interesting piece of this is the vectors, right? So unlike salmonella or things like this, it can kind of hang out and, bide their time in the environment or create a biofilm with Listeria or things like this. Most of these obligate parasite type, organisms and things like this need a vector, right?
Yeah, and I'm going to point at you and everyone else on the call today because really for many of these, the only habitat for these microorganisms are people. And when you have an infected person shed oocysts, live larvae, virus particles in their feces, it's just the typical fecal oral route of transmission. So that individual or groups of individuals then handle products that don't get a kill step in the process or a minimal kill step in the process, such as washing fresh produce.
Mhm.
And a lot of these outbreaks are limited to food service operations because it takes one worker in the back of the kitchen who is shedding virus. They may or may not be symptomatic, so they may or may not be presenting with diarrhea, but many food service operations don't give employees sick leave. So if you don't show up, you don't get paid. And so there's a disincentive to keep ill workers out of the back of the kitchen.
Mhm.
And so they begin handling and prepping salads and sandwiches that don't get cooked in the kitchen, present those to people who consume. The other nice thing about outbreak investigation is with the prolific use of credit cards, we can quickly trace back to an individual operator um, and link that to someone in the kitchen. So those are becoming much easier to solve because the credit card tracking helps us find what kinds of foods were consumed and where they were consumed, or where
Wow.
they might have been purchased in a grocery store operation.
Mhm. Well, that's good because from a microbiological standpoint, one of the things that has hindered us from a investigation standpoint has always been, culturing and plating. Because if you have something that isn't necessarily going to grow on a plate, you have to figure out other methods, right? You're going to do direct microscopy to examine samples from a patient, and these type of activities, which take a ton of time. So it's good to hear that the health departments and things like this are figuring out alternate ways to track this stuff down.
Yeah. I think one other factor that might be contributing to the numbers of outbreaks that we're seeing can be some climatic events, particularly in some of the growing regions for fresh produce. So, as you remember, not too long ago, California was awash in water.
Mhm.
And so, anytime you had sewage effluent that got untreated, it then gets transmitted in the environment. And so, if you have a crop growing at that particular time and that crop gets flooded, or you probably didn't need a lot of irrigation in California, but if it gets flooded, then that human untreated fecal material can get onto those products. So again, you're getting a transmission amongst families who work in the fields at harvest, and you have the potential for pre-harvest contamination due to some of these flood events.
Well, and definitely, and this is something I think this is a good example just from a food safety plan standpoint, is looking at these type of events and saying, okay, what has changed in the environment? What do I necessarily need to worry about? And you kind of trigger me on that, in that if you're working in a production facility, right, those same floodwaters that are rising up on those crops, what about backups in your drainage system in your plant? Because there's stuff hanging out in your drain system forever, and now all of a sudden those drains back up into your plant. Ooh, you got a big problem.
Yeah, and you also have a lot of displaced workers. So the places that tend to flood the most and
Mhm.
cause the most harm are usually the less economically successful communities. And so you've got displaced workers away from their home. They might be living in shelters, close contact with other people. Perhaps there's a lack of good sanitary facilities in those situations. So again, it's I hate to use a colloquial term, it's the perfect storm um, for contributing to these sorts of events.
Right. And to your point earlier with the importance of GMPs and washing your hands and all these type of activities, that just shows how much more important it is to double your efforts in those areas to make sure that these workers understand what's required. Because if you're a worker out in the field, you may or may not be aware of these type of risks to begin with.
Oh, I think training is always the Achilles heel,
Hmm.
particularly when you have a non-English speaking um, population in your facilities or out in the fields. And if all your SOPs are written in English, how do you translate that into a communicable form that is understandable by the intended audience?
Yeah. And one of the things that's very interesting with Cyclospora and Cryptosporidium as well is these little buggers are very good at surviving in the environment. So they will produce oocysts, little heart, think like a spore, right? Something like that,
Mhm.
that are able to survive in the environment for long, long periods of time. And one of the things I always look at when I go into plants, Doug, is that water vector. Plants use tons of water. They're cleaning, they're using it as an ingredient, they're doing all these type of activities. And a lot of times the water gets overlooked. And plants will say, "Oh, I've got city water. I'm fine. I don't have to worry about that. They chlorinate the water, and I'm all good." Well, I doubt a production facility in Flint, Michigan is going to agree with that. Um, so you have to really understand what it is that they're doing. And part of what people forget with Cryptosporidium in particular is that it's chlorine resistant, which is why a lot of times you'll see outbreaks in swimming pools.
Hmm. Yeah, when you think about these kind of washing plume systems, an analogy I like to use is imagine you are a member of a Marine platoon. You have just been out in the field all day doing your grunt work, and now it's time to come back and get cleaned up, and you have to share a communal bathtub. Do you want to be the first Marine into that tub, or do you want to be the last Marine in that tub? And so all it may take would be one part of a field that's contaminated. When they get into these packing sheds where there may or may not be a washing plume, um, once that contaminated portion gets in, it starts contaminating the equipment, contaminates the water, and so everything else that follows also is likely to be contaminated.
Mm, good point. And yeah, because with that contamination, then part of the problem is we don't have any good systems in the plant like we do for environmental monitoring for swabs and things like this of looking for this in the plant environment. Oh, bit of a technical issue here with Doug. Hopefully it buffers here. So with that, part of this as well is I'll put a link in here while we're waiting for Doug to reconnect here, is if you're not familiar with this is a great resource, is the Bad Bug Book. And in the Bad Bug Book, it goes through and provides descriptions and vectors and all these type of things for these type of analyses. So this is a really good way to get a good handle on these type of um, less attention paid to microorganisms and parasites that we have within our systems, and go through that and take a look at these and kind of evaluate the different type of vectors and analysis and these type of things. And I think part of it too is with these type of organisms, um, they're not necessarily life threatening, right? You're going to get really sick, right, Doug? And you're not going to be happy for a number of days, but you're going to get over it. And so I think maybe that's part of the reason too, it doesn't necessarily get the attention it deserves, right?
Yeah, sorry, had bandwidth issues there for a second. Um, yeah, I'll just give myself as an example. So a couple of years ago, decided to take a long weekend off in the middle of the COVID lockdown and went to rural parts of Wyoming and North Dakota. And one night, my family and I, we went to Walmart and grabbed a bag of ready to eat lettuce.
Mhm.
And we all had that as part of our in room dinner that night. I got cyclospora. The rest of my family didn't. I was part of a large recall, so I knew exactly what happened because that was the product that we in fact purchased. But my symptoms were relatively mild. It was diarrhea for about a day, no fever, no chills. So it wasn't a bad experience, other than the fact that it kind of negatively affected my enjoyment of being out in the middle of nowhere. Uh, because you have to be close to your porcelain god to be able to treat your symptoms. Um, and I think one of the other things you might want to think about is if you are a buyer of fresh produce and you're using it in your products or serving it in your restaurants. A question you should ask in your supplier verification program for these kinds of parasites is, where do you collect verification data, to your point, that gives you confidence that your supplier has these under control?
Mm.
So if it is a finished product test, there's a couple of problems with that. Number one, it's a perishable product. Testing for these organisms is not easy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not cheap, and it has high rates of potentially giving you data that don't make any sense. Or you could consider what the supplier is doing in terms of pre-harvest controls, because if you can control it out in the field, then whatever in-process interventions you're using may or may not have increased efficacy.
Mm.
So again, and I don't have a good answer to the question, when do you start collecting verification data points to be able to demonstrate that you as a supplier, you have control over these parasites in your products?
That's some really good points in there. So one of the ones that I wanted to make sure and emphasize that everybody may have missed on this is this again goes back to the important in your food safety plan, the importance of having a good supplier verification program. And in examples like this, testing probably isn't going to be a very good methodology. To your point, there's not good systems in place for the laboratories to evaluate. It's more of a post-infection type evaluation to determine where it came from. So you really need to be, if you are dealing with these high-risk items, so fresh produce coming from the field and being delivered where tick, 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 right? These things have very limited shelf life and they don't have time to test. So if you're buying these type of materials and using them in your processes and thinking, oh, I'll run it through a chlorine bath when I bring it into my facility, not enough. You need to go out and understand and say, okay, I need to take a look at your training programs. I need to understand your GMPs. How are you controlling for these risks? If you have, to your point earlier, Doug, if your fields have flooded and are potentially contaminated, what type of plans do you have in place to deal with these type of risks? And you need to understand that. And it goes back to when you're looking at your supplier control programs under FSBP and under your FSMA program itself as a larger umbrella, you are responsible for understanding the risks that your suppliers are handling and what they're doing to mitigate that. So if you're not doing a good job on your side, you could potentially have a 483 as a result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to give you an example. This is a learning that I got this week when I attended the Center for Produce Safety annual meeting. And a lot of the fresh leafy greens and perhaps other fresh vegetable processors will screen their supply chain, meaning their farms and their ranches, and they will do on-site audits. So they can do that internally or they can outsource it to a third party. And one of the things that's on an audit checklist is looking for bird presence in or around the growing field.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's bird presence, then the auditor will check that off and proclaim that that's probably not what you want to be seeing, are birds around a lettuce patch. But there was an interesting study that says that the mere presence of birds does not necessarily elevate the food safety risk of that harvest. And their study said that the size of the bird pat, so if a bird is in a field and leaving droppings on a leaf, for example, the size of that dropping matters,
Mm-hmm.
and the bird source matters. So, as it turns out, small songbirds, so things like sparrows and those birds, leave small droppings, and salmonella doesn't seem to be prevalent in those birds. And if it is, the size of the drop, it dries out quickly. It's exposed to UV radiation on a leaf. It doesn't seem to survive very long. Versus larger birds, particularly birds that come in large population numbers during migrations. So we've all seen these images of flocks of starlings where you have hundreds, if not thousands, of birds in one flock. You can imagine if they do a bombing run on your lettuce patch, you're pretty much going to be plowing that field under after that kind of heavy fecal contamination event. And if you're not, then that's clearly a pre-harvest control that you are not implementing very well.
Wow. Gosh, I mean, fascinating that, yeah, these different species. And so part of this could be as well, too, is migratory patterns. So this definitely sounds like this is emerging information, but so the size of the bird, the species of the bird, the size of its droppings, all these type of activities, because we've heard about the potential contamination from workers in the field and things of this nature. We've also heard about, larger animals such as deer or things like this. So it sounds like we're almost kind of going in the direction of how can we hermetically seal our fields, right? I mean, that's not even really possible, is it? If you're a produce grower, how in the world would you even keep these birds away to begin with?
Well, there are strategies that you could do. Netting, you could use pinwheels, loud noises, spinning lights at night. There are some mitigation strategies you could try, but birds are smart, and the smart ones are going to laugh at human folly. And as soon as they realize there is no harm associated with those devices, then they stop working. But there is a way that you can do this, Brian, and that's with indoor grow houses.
True.
So you can do greenhouse farming. And some have believed that those are safer than outdoor farming. But we've had a few recent outbreaks that have demonstrated that that, in fact, is not true.
Yeah.
So
And, yeah.
again, you still need control over your growth media. You still need control over your irrigation water. You still need control over vermin. And so you have similar problems, just a different growing environment.
Yeah, I've heard issues in the past where hydroponic operations have become contaminated because of the water supply for all the different plants that are growing in this media. And
Yeah,
Corey's having fun in the comments here.
yeah, if your Listeria monocytogenes, for example, I would think a greenhouse grow operation would be a very lovely environment to hang out in.
Oh, yeah. I've also heard, too, that Salmonella has the ability to actually get inside of plant cells and hang out.
Yeah, and we've known that particularly the spray nozzles on irrigation misting devices, those can get biofilm formation and be a constant contamination source. That's both at the retail level, by the way, in the produce section, as well as in a greenhouse grow environment.
Oh, that's a good point. I'm going to do some grocery shopping here this weekend. So yeah, I'm going to be going like this and looking at those nozzles that are spraying that pretty mist down all over the produce at the grocery store.
We'll stop by. I'll give you a couple swabs, and we can actually figure that out.
Oh, see, Corey had a question here. Is there anything a company can do once a bacteria is inside the plant cell?
Inside a plant cell. Okay.
I think she's referencing, the example I just given with Salmonella getting inside.
Yeah. Well, think of it this way. If it's in the foliage or if it's in a stem, remember it has to traverse the plant. So it has to be pulled up in the water. It has to diffuse through the other tissues of the plant to actually get to whatever the edible portion is. If it's a fruit, like a tomato, a cucumber, or a berry, that transition takes a while, and I would think you would have a dilution effect. Mm-hmm. So if it's in a leaf and the leaf is edible, then I think you have a problem. So we know this is theoretically possible, where you put a high dose of Salmonella in soil or in irrigation water, and it can wick up into the plant. But think about this. Should a grower be having high levels of Salmonella in the irrigation water or in the growing soil? And the answer should be no. So if you just have an occasional contaminant, you're not going to get the entire field contaminated with salmonella because of that ability to get into the plant. But to the question, there really isn't anything you can do other than irradiate to eliminate salmonella if it gets incurred into the edible portion of the product.
Interesting. So it sounds like at the conference you got some great information around this new research around avian sources and of vectors of contamination. We were talking about water, right? So FDA is been really pushing and frankly kind of struggling on their guidance relative to water and how to manage that. Any thoughts around that?
Well, I think the default is going back to EPA water quality testing, where you're just testing for coliforms and E. coli. Mm-hmm. And if the water passes both of those threshold values, then it's fit for use. But you're not testing for parasites. You're not testing for E. coli 0157 and related STECs. You're not testing for Listeria monocytogenes. And I think the big problem the industry had with FDA's initial water testing rule, number one, is it was complicated because you had different threshold values that you could meet. It was expensive. And it's that the frequency of testing required with a whole bunch of small lot producers didn't make it attractive to any testing laboratory business because it was simple testing. It would cost a laboratory a lot of money just to set up and maintain an account for a farmer that's sending in 4 samples a year.
Yeah.
So it just didn't have a lot of practical value to the industry. And to FDA's credit, they went back and rethought what they expected for water testing in the produce safety rule.
Interesting. Now, so it sounds like out of the produce safety meeting, you got some really good information. Any other little nuggets that came out of there that caught your attention?
Well, here's one that I think is a raging debate that we are getting more information on it, but a real lack of what do we do with it now. And that's related to growing fresh produce near concentrated animal agriculture facilities. So this would these concentrated animal agriculture facilities could be poultry operations, they could be cattle feedlots, they could be cattle grazing areas in close proximity to a fresh produce field. And there's the question of setback size or distance. How far do you have to be to feel confident that you can grow fresh produce near one of these facilities? And then if you are relatively adjacent, how do you communicate with the owner of that concentrated animal agriculture facility that what they
Mid-sentence. We're going to wait for Doug on this one.
do
Come on, internet.
Has an impact on the safety of what happens on Mars.
We rely so much on technology, don't we? To share information and everything else. So hopefully Doug will get back here in a bit. So we'll have him circle back on this and re-explain what he's talking about. But part of this is the setback piece of it, from my perspective, is any type of land that you're not using is wasted money. And how do you then mitigate and provide these buffer zones in between? So I'm going to be curious to hear what Doug has to say about that as well. The other piece, as we're waiting for this connection to buffer, is encroachment. So you have these traditional areas of produce farming. Let's
Can
see
you
here.
Hey,
there you are.
I don't know what's going on with my connection, but I keep bugging out. Apologies. So I just logged out and signed back in. Maybe that'll clean up the ether mess. Anywho,
Fingers.
what I was saying was distance away from a concentrated animal agriculture facility. How far does it have to be safe? Nobody knows the answer. But one of the studies was looking at the impact of dust.
Oh,
So when the wind blows and it crosses and pulls pathogens from the environment, and then that settles onto a fresh produce field, what do you do as a grower to mitigate the potential for that dust to contain pathogens? And again, nobody knows, but what we do know is that dust can transit pathogens from a relatively narrow foci point. Let's say it's a feedlot. And if you're downwind from that feedlot, you can expect to get animal pathogens on your field. So how long do you wait to harvest? Do you spray some sort of antimicrobial foliar treatment on your field? We have no answers to these questions.
well, then that also then overlaps with consumer expectations. I expect my product to be 100% pesticide free, organically grown. All the lettuce is individually massaged and given a sole rub before it's shipped to the store. You know, all of these type of things, and something's got to give. Um, I was thinking here while the buffering was catching up as well, is if you have these mitigation areas between these different operations, that's non-productive land. And if you're a farmer producing a commodity product, you don't have a lot of luxury to do that. That's lost income for you.
Yeah, and you also have probably no leverage on your neighbor.
Yeah.
I really would like it if you put up berms around your feedlot to maybe act as a physical barrier. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks. I appreciate the
Yeah.
suggestion. You going to pay for it?
Exactly. Yeah. It's just like, imagine all the trouble you have with neighbors just trying to put up a fence between your properties, right, for your home. The other side of it then too is encroachment. So you have these traditional areas, so the valley in California, all these areas where it was all farmland. And as everybody is encroaching on these type of operations now, so you have what used to be wide open spaces with farms. Now you have a farm with houses right up against those farms as well. And to your point earlier around mitigation activities for birds and things of this nature, those new neighbors aren't going to be very happy with you if you're blaring out horns or lights or other type of discouragements for flying, vectors to avoid your field. So now you've got to worry about that as well.
Well, maybe the only good thing is if you let your cat out, you have a vermin control program sponsored by your neighbor.
Well, it's kind of funny too, because you reminded me when we were talking here about feedlots and contamination. There was a big, do you remember that Cadbury chocolate recall? It was maybe like 5-7 years ago? Huge salmonella outbreak. And I went to a conference and the head of quality for Cadbury was very transparent about it, of what happened. And he gave an excellent presentation. And they had tracked it down to exactly what you said. They had a drain pipe from the roof that was corroded, and there was a small hole. It was maybe like this big in the picture he put up on the slide. That was over a production line in the facility where the chocolate was passing. And he said that little hole in that pipe cost our company, what was it, $20 million or something crazy. And they tracked it back to an upstream poultry processing facility that was not too far away from that plant that contaminated the roof, got down into the plant.
Yeah, and sometimes those little holes, they don't drip water where it's visual. They send a fine mist that when you look up, you literally can't visually see that you've got a leak over there. But that fine mist then aerosolizes and carries all throughout your facility.
Huh. One of the things, I had a conversation with a produce director for food safety about some of the things that they were doing in their fields. And this was very interesting. I'm curious if this came up with the conference as well, is they were beginning to use GPS tracking in their fields. So they would track where the workers were operating and what areas they were harvesting, and then linking that to that produce for that harvest. So if something did happen, they knew the particular area in the field that that issue came from. And so they wouldn't have to recall everything. They could kind of zero in on that particular area, which kind of then overlaps with what you were saying earlier with, kind of these sporadic inoculants, birds coming in and causing havoc in a particular area of the field or things of this nature. So that's some really cool technology as well. Anything on drones or anything like that for monitoring fields? Anything come up in those areas?
No, not at this conference. I think the whole drone thing, there was some excitement that you could use different wavelengths to do image capture with drones, and then somehow the reflectance of materials in the field can be correlated with whether or not there's fecal contamination in the field. But I don't think that that has ever been fully exploited nor commercialized. Primarily, I'm a little skeptical that it actually works.
Mm-hmm.
But I've seen people proposing that as a potential pre-harvest solution.
Hmm.
And then if you've got a reflectance signal, you would simply quarantine that portion of the field and not harvest from that field.
Interesting. So I wonder as well too, as we're kind of looking at this emerging technology side, you see these robot pickers now that can go in and look at fruit on the plants and say, oh, that tomato's ready, and grab that guy and leave the other ones alone. You have to wonder if they're developing technology in those areas then for that type of ability to remove bird droppings, right? Because obviously then, that nice white bird dropping is going to show up pretty clearly, right?
Perhaps. I think maybe a more relevant intervention that is real today is what are the sanitation practices for this harvesting equipment?
Mm.
The equipment stays in the field. You don't ever pull it out of the field unless you're moving it to an adjacent field. And do you have access to detergents and sanitizers or hot water? How do you clean this equipment during the course of its use? Because if you don't clean it, you've got food residue there. It's probably wet because of the food residue. Great environment for biofilms to form because it's sitting outside in the middle of the summer. And so is that the source of contamination?
Ooh.
And if it is, how do you mitigate that risk?
Good question. I mean, really, this conversation here today, it's always interesting, and this is one of the things that on the food safety chat that we emphasize is we tend to stay inside our box of information, right? So if you work in dairy, you understand all those type of things. But really, when you look at everything that's going on here in these industries with produce, is really, Doug, what this sounds like to me, as we're going with all these different type of vectors and everything that we're talking about, essentially, if you're growing crops, you just have a big outdoor food facility, don't you?
That's unfortunately for the industry, that is how we are evolving in our thinking of pre-harvest controls. And remember, the consumer has an expectation that fresh fruit and vegetables are free from environmental contamination. And if you've ever tried to grow anything on your own in your backyard or on your patio, you know that you are hosting an enormous variety of biological organisms in that grow system. Some are good and some aren't so good. And how do you control them in that environment? It's exceptionally difficult. And that's why the focus has always been on post-harvest interventions. Well, we'll just run them through a water plume, and we'll just have to be happy with a 1 to 2 log reduction in that washing environment. And I think that for most circumstances, that 1 or 2 log reduction is probably good enough, because you're not, in theory, you're not putting a lot of pathogens on the product in the field if you can control it.
Right.
So the population of that load should be relatively low. Therefore, even a minimally successful intervention probably has a good public health outcome.
Hmm. Interesting. Not sure if you know the answer to this or not, but I'm going to throw the question out there. And if anybody in the chat has any information on this, I'd love to hear it too. Any information correlating to particular types of crops? Because it seems like certain ones keep coming up. So romaine lettuce, for example, is that just a feature of that particular type of plant, or is there some other factor that causes that?
Um, great question. I'll just give you a couple of ideas, some of which have some science. I'm not sure it's been published yet. But when you think about a leafy green, if you take a iceberg head of lettuce, for example, that's a very tight packed mass of leaves, then I don't think we hardly ever have an outbreak associated with that kind of lettuce because
Mm-hmm.
of the physical nature. And then you're also peeling off usually the outer layer or two of those leaves and then getting down into leaves that really haven't been exposed to the environment.
Mm.
So that kind of lettuce to me, just because of its nature, would be safer than like a romaine where you've got an open leaf
Yeah.
canopy. And I'm eating Colorado lettuce the last few weeks, and I will tell you that at the base of each leaf, on the outer leaves, there is a little patch of soil.
Mm.
Okay. And when you think about that little area at the bottom of around the base of the plant, so if you are getting rainwater or irrigation water, that's going to easily trickle down to the base of those leaves. You get any soil that's blown in, or just as the plant's growing out of the soil, you'll get soil and dirt in that base part. And so I think the evidence might show that that portion of the plant is probably has a higher microbial population than would the outer leaves that are exposed to the UV radiation and tend to dry faster than the rest of the plant.
Interesting.
So I think those might be some contributing factors.
No, that does make sense. Yeah, because to your earlier example, so dust that's blowing into a field and bringing, pathogens from a nearby cattle operation or things of this nature, and then you've got the romaine lettuce that is funneling and collecting that material down toward the base. So, So really, and this kind of gets into consumer communication and things of this nature because I'm thinking of myself now as a consumer of these products. So, okay, I'm going to be cleaning the romaine lettuce in my house. I'm pulling off the outside leaves. I'm going to chop a good chunk off the bottom of that stalk, right, to try and capture and remove that soil and then hopefully reduce that risk. But as I kind of work through these things as we're talking, uh, I I never see any information that's publicly communicated. Hey, here's a message from the produce industry. Make sure and do this to minimize your risk, right? None of that.
Well, the only intervention that you hear is wash your produce for safety.
Yeah.
And when you have microbes attached to surfaces of foods, they don't want to leave. So if you just run it under tap water, they're not going anywhere. Now you can wash the soil off, and that will reduce the population. But anything that's attached to those leaf surfaces or on the peel, of an apple and so forth, they don't want to leave, and so you can rinse them to your heart's desire, and they don't leave. An example I'll give you: if you eat table grapes, for example,
Mhm.
when you purchase them from the store, they have a visual biofilm on the surface of those grapes. It looks like a little white film. So that's just natural yeast that have grown on the grapes. It's not unsafe. I mean, that's how we make kickapoo juice out of grapes is, you've got those yeast already there at a relatively high population. But you rinse those off in the sink and it looks like you remove the white film,
Oh, come on. Come on,
but
internet.
it's what
I love how he's frozen.
so you can't really see. And as soon as you dry the grapes, what's remaining?
Ah, shoot. Come on. Missed all of that
Back
on,
again.
washing the grapes. Circle back on that because that's super important. So you
All
wash
right.
the
So
grapes.
when you wash the grapes,
Ah, the internet gods are not cooperating today, guys. So Austin, I see your question down there. So as soon as we get Doug back here, we'll ask again. So what's kind of cool about this conversation again is I'm not produce, right? Dairy and CPG and beverage and things like this, and you can kind of see these cross reactions with this. Let's see. Okay, fingers crossed, Doug.
wash the grapes. The film looks like it's removed. Let it dry. What do the grapes look like? They still have the film on them. So that simple act of washing didn't remove that biofilm of yeast on a grape. So
Yeah, on that point then too is a lot of times too they actually apply coatings to different types of fruits and things of this nature as well, right? So waxes and things like this to allow those products to sit on shelf longer, right? So you're probably locking those pathogens in as well.
good comment. There was a study this week that demonstrated that waxing um, allowed for greater die-off of pathogens on the surfaces of the fruits that were tested.
Ah.
So before, I would have shared exactly the same thought. And that was the objective to the study, was to actually test whether this was true or not. And in fact, the waxing conferred a better outcome than not waxing.
Wow. Yeah. Counterintuitive. I would not have thought that. Austin had a question here. Let's get this guy in here, hopefully. So strawberries. What's up with strawberries? Why are they so problematic?
Well, strawberries grow close to the ground. So they're usually they put plastic sheeting to keep the strawberries from actually touching the soil when they're grown. They are a water intensive crop, so you do need to irrigate them with some frequency. They usually there is a foliar application sometime during the growing season. And so you're applying that product using a atomized spray. So depending on the water quality of that foliar application, if they're pulling it from irrigation ditch water to make up the spray tank, then that could be a source of contamination. Much of this crop is hand harvested. So again, when you think about a strawberry patch, you've got a bunch of workers going through. They get paid by the bucket that they harvest. And if they have to use the toilet because they are suffering from gastroenteritis, they don't have toilets there. They might have a porta pot at one end of the field.
Yeah.
And if you have to put your bucket down and hike over to that other end of the field to be able to drop your diarrhea pile, number one, you don't have time. Number two, you've got a huge sense of urgency, not only because you've got to relieve yourself, but you also don't want to spend the time hiking over to the porta pot and then hiking back.
Yeah.
And then lastly, when you do defecate, do you have a hand wash facility anywhere nearby? Probably not.
Yeah, and so it kind of gets back to our discussion around restaurant workers earlier, right? So taking that hike to the other side of the field, that's money, right? That's money out of your pocket.
Yeah, and so a lot of folks, like it or not, they will pull down their pants and let her rip and move on. And so not only is that worker contaminating everything that they've touched during the day, but they've also deposited the pathogens right into and perhaps onto that windrow of product.
Right. And then subsequently, anybody who goes by that area later on is going to continue transmitting that to other areas as well. Yeesh.
And the other big factor is that individual probably lives in a community housing environment with other workers. And we know that these pathogens, particularly something like norovirus, which is highly infectious, is going to very quickly pass through that living environment. And other workers then are going to follow the next day, and it becomes kind of a mushroom cloud experience.
Yeah, Austin. Oh my God. Yeah, food safety is not always pretty, is it? In what we do. Yeah. So your norovirus, right? And so any type of a confined space, so cruise ships, right? And just this massive incubator out on the ocean, that's a perfect place for these type of things to spread like wildfire. And you hear these nightmare stories. But I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't follow the cruise industry that close, but it seems like they've gotten that under control. I haven't heard of any large outbreaks recently. Have you?
No. And remember, however, that when a cruise ship leaves port, it is no longer under U.S. jurisdiction.
Mm.
So they may not have a legal obligation to report anything that happens on that ship when it's out of port.
Ooh, good point. Good point. Wow. So, my goodness, let's try and bring this back to the 30,000 foot level and summarize this. So, clearly, guys, what we're talking about here today is the organisms that get all of the attention, Salmonella and Listeria and 0157 and things like this. We need to look at those and we need to control those. But man, don't forget about these other guys too. There's a reason why these are listed in the bad bug book. These are risks, and we always have in the food industry emerging vectors and new type of things that are happening. If you're connected with me in locals.com, one of the things in there that I talk about all the time is enoki mushrooms, right? Oh my goodness. It's like recall after recall for Listeria in enoki mushrooms. Why? I'm not sure why, right? Is it part of the growing conditions that they're growing these mushrooms in? I would bet that's probably pretty close to it. But a lot of times too, as a consumer, Doug, you have to look at these high risk items and decide for yourself and say, I don't know if I should be eating this. And especially if you're in a high risk group.
Well, we've been kind of Debbie Downer on this talk today. So how about I give you maybe a counter argument? And that is, because you're eating live tissues when you're eating fresh produce, the microorganisms that are part of the microbiota of that plant, you're also consuming live. And many of those organisms are good organisms for you to be ingesting.
Mm.
So there is a reasonable thought out there that consuming these sorts of good bacteria when you are consuming fresh produce confers a health benefit to you because it may improve your immune system that allows you to better tolerate an infectious disease agent when it's presented to you. It colonizes your gut and prevents an open apartment door for any of these pathogens to be able to colonize your gut.
Mm-hmm.
So there may be some health benefits to consuming fresh produce. Now, the nutrition community has been arguing for years that fresh is best. And I can personally tell you that's been one of the greatest things that's ever happened to pathogenic food microbiologists is it's given us a very secure job arena to play in because we keep having these outbreaks and we keep having these conversations.
Yep, it just shows that I mean, it's an incredibly complex field of work that we're in, and that these threats are constantly evolving and changing, and awareness is a big part of this. And not only as a manufacturer in a particular market, you need to be aware of what's going on in other markets as well in these spaces, so you can learn from what they're learning. And also as consumers, right? We all eat food. And so definitely it's a good point, Doug. And I want to make sure that we emphasize this as well, is we're not saying, okay, great, I'm done with fresh produce. I'm never going to eat, I'm going to stick to Twinkies and Skittles from now on. No, yeah, that's everything involves risk, and you need to be aware of these risks and act appropriately. There's things that you can avoid, but there's other things that you're going to have to deal with that. So how can you minimize those risks? So for example, Convenience has introduced new risk into our products as well. So taking that romaine lettuce and now chopping it up and throwing it in a bag with some other stuff, right? We've seen recall after recall associated with that. Fruits, cantaloupe, or things of this nature that are the same thing, chopped up and put in fruit mixes and things of this nature so that you can just open it up and serve it at your party. These introduce new risks, and you need to be aware of those.
Yeah, I want to give you finish this up here with a kind of a view of history. So when we were early knuckle dragging bipedal hominids, one thing that somebody discovered was a risk reduction strategy was to pickle your vegetables. And so that act of fermenting gave early humanity two advantages to survive. One was it was a great preservative. So we got extended shelf life of products that you're harvesting in the warm growing months. You could still consume in another form during the winter. The second thing that it did, that high acid environment essentially eliminated the pathogens that might have been present on that material. So if you are high risk consumer, but you still want to consume something that's fresh, like in your produce, you may want to consider, and you could do fresh pickling, right? You don't have to do fermentation pickling. You could just chop up your veggies and throw them in some vinegar, and voila, you've got that high acid of that vinegar acts as an antimicrobial, changes the flavor profile, but that's not that bad. So
Right.
that's something you can have control over in your home.
That's a good point, right? We play a part in this, right? I guess is kind of the messaging with this as well, is making sure that you're handling stuff just like at the restaurant. When we were talking at the beginning of this chat with restaurant workers, make sure that you're not cross-contaminating and you're aware of these type of risks in your house as well. And who are you serving these foods to? If grandma and grandpa are coming over for lunch, what are you serving, right? So I think enoki mushrooms, definitely no, right? You shouldn't eat those either. So you hear me say this all the time on locals, don't eat those enoki mushrooms. And speaking of, let me throw here in the comments. So I put all kinds of posts in locals here over this last week. And of course, it's free to join, relative to norovirus, cyclospora, hepatitis, cryptosporidium. I've got 2 examples of each of those just from the past few weeks on recalls and investigations that are going on with these minor type pathogens that can wreak havoc on our lives. So check them out. Knowledge is important. Any other closing thoughts here, Doug, while we close out our chat here for today?
Well, just apologize for the bandwidth issues we've been having here. I don't have any idea what's going on. Whether it's my side, I'll take the blame for it, and I'm gonna check my link up speed here when we descend to finishing up our day on Friday. But again, always a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, I appreciate everybody's patience as well working through this. So hopefully my jabbering in between Doug's pearls of wisdom kept everybody moving along here with the subject. I appreciate it as well. So thanks everybody again for joining us for the chat today and taking a slightly different look at how we look at food safety and how we're managing our business. And we appreciate all that you do. So we will see you back here next week for the next food safety chat. Same time, so 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, and we live stream on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. So join us next week for the next chat where we have our next guest on for the next fascinating food safety topic. So Doug, my friend, have a great weekend. Everybody else, enjoy your time away, and we'll see you back here next week. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.